Several minutes ago, when Aang was explaining to Sidu Liu how to harness her core energy, she looked into his eyes and asked if she would be the one to deliver the final blow to the demon. While both were sitting on the floor next to the room where the demon was located, she reminded him that this was a 5-finnied demon, and on top of that, it was a unique type, smarter than the rest of the demons. She feared that if its defense was too high, they wouldn't be able to bring it down quickly. As Aang looked into her eyes, he started smiling and explained that he would force the demon to use all its power in a single point of attack with him. So once it used up all its energy in the attack, its defense would become incredibly weak, and that would be the perfect moment for them to launch a stealthy attack against it. Taking advantage of the demon's distraction, Sidu Liu threw with all her strength the spear made of green core energy towards it. It turned its head back, and as it saw how slowly the spear she had thrown was approaching, it was left speechless and soon realized that they had planned this particular attack from the beginning. It tried to react to the attack, but it was in vain. Just before it could make any move, Sidu Liu's spear pierced through its chest, breaking part of its ribs and leaving the integration crystal visible. Sidu Liu began pointing at the demon with her finger, and while she was looking at it with a murderous gaze, she remained silent without making any movement. This energy gathering method that Aang had taught her allowed her to recover a great amount of power from her unique core. She couldn't believe that by using this power, she had managed to pierce through a demon's body. After the demon received the attack, Sidu Liu realized that it had used up all its energy in defense. The demon lowered its head slightly towards its chest, and upon seeing that the spear had pierced its body, it was shocked. Quickly, it used the regeneration ability of the wood element, but the ability had no effect. Upon realizing this, the demon began to tremble as it realized that it couldn't heal the wound. Aang praised Sidu Liu, then he gained momentum and started advancing quickly towards the demon. It turned its head slightly to one side, and upon seeing Aang approaching at high speed and ready to attack, it panicked and became alert at the same time. Just before the demon could make a move, Aang reached out towards it and in the blink of an eye grabbed the crystal, delivering another strong blow to its chest in the process. While Aang was holding the crystal in his hand, he began to distance himself from the demon, and within seconds, it fell to its knees on the ground. The demon tried once again to use its wood element healing ability, but once more failed. Realizing this, its body started trembling and slowly the fire element began to extinguish. With its last strength, the demon asked Aang why it couldn't regenerate. Upon hearing the demon's voice, Aang slightly turned his body towards it and, while holding the crystal in his hand, began to smile, and explained to the demon that the energy present in Sidu Liu's attack was the purest form of regenerative energy. When this energy was used as an attack, it rejected any forms of regenerative energy that did not come from the attacker's own body. Gradually, the fire element started to extinguish, and the demon fell to the ground. Its final words were that Aang had known this all along. Several seconds later, Sidu Liu came running towards Aang and asked if he was okay. Upon hearing her voice, he turned his head towards her. While holding the crystal in his hand, he winked at her and with a smile replied that he was fine. He also added that thanks to her, they had managed to obtain the core. He winked at her again and called her a genius since the last blow she had just delivered had been incredible. Upon hearing these words, Sidu Liu couldn't help but blush. She stared into Aang's eyes for several seconds. Then she winked back at him, turned her head to the side, crossed her arms, and replied that it wasn't a big deal. Deep down, she thought it was true because she didn't want to drag him down. Aang lowered his hands, turned his body towards her, and asked if she had exhausted a lot of energy with that previous hit. In response, she extended her hands to the sides and explained to him that she was fine since she could still move freely. While they were conversing, the footsteps of the warriors approaching the room began to be heard. Quickly, Sidu Liu turned her head towards the door, and upon hearing the steps, she realized they were in danger. As she was looking at the door with an aggressive look, she realized that Aang was right since the warriors had found them very quickly. Aang also turned his head towards the door and with a serious look explained to Sidu Liu that some of the warriors had exceptional senses and were able to accurately locate energy waves from a battle. He also added that a group with someone like that on their team was very difficult to deal with. Quickly, both activated their cores and gaining momentum, they began to move quickly towards the exit. While Aang was heading towards the exit, he explained to her that the steps were coming from the left side, so they had to find a way to escape this place through the right side. He decided to take this opportunity to flee from the area. At that moment, Aang felt something, and not long after, he started bleeding from his mouth. While holding onto the core with one hand, he placed the other hand over his mouth and fell to his knees on the ground. Upon seeing that Aang was not moving, Sidu Liu turned her head towards him, and upon seeing that he was bleeding, she was shocked. Quickly, she approached him and grabbed his arm to help him. In the process, he dropped the integration crystal. As the crystal rolled on the floor, she asked Aang if he was okay. While Aang had one hand and his knees on the ground, he began to wonder what was happening. He was certain that he hadn't been hit by the demon's attack. Not long after, Aang began to feel a strong pain in his chest. Quickly, he placed one hand on his chest and the other on the ground. While dragging the fingers of his hand along the floor, he closed one eye and started bleeding from his mouth. He felt immense pain throughout his body. As his body trembled, he began to scream. Seeing this, Sidu Liu asked if he was injured anywhere. While Aang had his head and both arms supported on the ground, he opened his eyes and clenched his teeth tightly while still bleeding from his mouth. Now he understood everything. His body had reached its limits. This body was originally weaker than most, and although the synchronization rate had increased, it still wasn't enough. During this period of time, he had used all his demonic energy too many times, and now his body had reached its limit. Sidu Liu approached him, crouched down, placed one hand on the ground and the other on top of her knee. With his last bit of strength, Aang grabbed the crystal, and as he was bringing it closer to Sidu Liu, he asked her to take this crystal and leave from here. Upon hearing this, she was surprised as she couldn't believe what he was saying. Aang knew that the other warriors were almost reaching this place, so he asked her to take this crystal and leave from here first. He also added that he would join her later. Just before he could finish speaking, she interrupted him and grabbed his arm, asking him to stop talking nonsense. She helped Aang to stand up, supporting his shoulder on hers. She turned her head towards him and told him that they were both going to get out of here together. Several seconds later, the two of them left the room. She turned her head towards Aang and with a furious look explained to him that despite not having any idea what had happened to him, there was no time for explanations because as the team leader, she would never abandon him. In front of them was a tunnel that could take them to the surface, so she asked Aang to stay with her since once they were outside, the fresh air would make him feel better. She also added that the cemetery castle should have other ways to exit, especially with architectural designs like these. Aang simply started looking at the ground and remained silent. Several minutes later, Aang and Sidu Liu reached the surface through the stairs. Because she had been carrying Aang on her shoulder, she was quite tired. Upon seeing that they had reached the surface, she thought that if they continued in this direction, they could escape from this castle. Several seconds later, Sidu Liu slightly raised her head and saw that in front of her there was a large building similar to a church. Upon looking at it more closely, she realized that it was quite familiar to her. This building was so similar to the building of her dreams. At that moment, several warriors gained momentum and with a big leap, they came out of the entrance. Upon noticing their presence, Sidu Liu's expression changed drastically. The warriors landed right in front of Sidu Liu and Aang. A quintupled finned warrior with a red core started smiling as he had been right to join their team. For him, the triplets had insane detection abilities. In front of Aang and Sidu Liu, there were 6 warriors, 3 of them being triplets. The warrior who had his arms crossed and was looking at Sidu Liu, and Aang told them that since they were all quintuple fin warriors, they could set aside formalities. The warrior who had his feet and both hands on the ground started staring at Aang with a smile, and asked the triplets if it was the 2 of them who had caused the recent battle. While Sidu Liu had Aang's shoulder resting on hers, she began to look at the warriors with a fearful gaze as she realized that if they faced the 6 quintuple fin warriors, then they would lose. The warrior who was standing with his arms crossed began to stare intently at Sidu Liu, as he couldn't believe that he was seeing a warrior with a single fin inside the castle. He asked them if there were only 2 people in their team. Upon seeing that Aang was gravely injured, it didn't take him long to come to the conclusion that he had been the one fighting against the demon. Upon looking more closely, he noticed that Aang was holding the crystal in his hand. Upon realizing this, his expression changed drastically. He began pointing at Aang with his finger and caught the attention of the others to reveal that what he had in his hand was the integration crystal. Upon hearing this, the Red Core Warrior and Triplet Number 1 were surprised. The 6 warriors activated their cores and assumed an offensive stance. While Triplet Number 1 had both hands behind his back, he started staring at Aang and told the others that this was great because coming here hadn't been a complete waste after all. He also added that now they were going to take the integration crystal with them. While the Red Core Warrior was staring at Aang, he smiled and told the others that their group would be the first to obtain the crystal. As Sidu Liu carried Aang on her shoulder, she began to look at the warriors. Then she clenched her teeth tightly and started wondering what she should do. She alone wasn't strong enough to confront all 6 warriors. She couldn't help but feel anger because if only she had been a little stronger, then she could have been protecting Aang instead. While she was lost in her thoughts, Aang began to stand up. Upon realizing this, she turned her head towards him and asked what he was doing. While Aang had his hand covered in blood and was holding the integration crystal, He started to bring it closer to her and asked for her help by grabbing the integration core. She turned her head towards him with a confused look and started wondering what he was doing. While blood was dripping from Aang's mouth, with his last strength, he lifted his head and explained to her that the motive of these warriors was simply to obtain the integration crystal. Now that they were here, he couldn't allow them to return home alive. Without thinking too much about it, she grabbed the crystal with both hands, then turned her head towards Aang and with a worried look asked him if his body was okay. Aang activated the red core and while slowly getting up, he replied that at least he could still hold his sword. He unsheathed the sword, and because he didn't have much strength, he started dragging it on the ground while slowly advancing towards the warriors. He began to look down and reminded her that he was a warrior who would continue fighting until his last breath. Aang distanced himself from her and using his last bit of strength, he put the sword on his shoulder. Upon seeing this, triplet number 3 realized that Aang was a quintuple fin warrior. Noticing that he was willing to fight despite being injured, triplet number 3 thought that Aang was quite interesting. The red core warrior, who was sitting on the ground with both hands resting on his knees, asked the others if they wanted to join them in finishing him off. The green-haired warrior reached out to Aang and revealed that there were only 6 different quintuple fin warriors here. Triplet number 2 told Aang that if he was smart and handed over the crystal, then he would grant them both a quicker death. Aang activated the red core and while looking down, he started to wonder why the demonic energy in his body was so little that he could barely feel it. He didn't know if this was because his body was suffering the consequences of that incredible demonic energy. It didn't take him long to come to the conclusion that this battle was going to be long and hard. The 6 warriors stepped on the ground forcefully to gain momentum. Triplet number 3 told the others that here everyone was on their own, so whoever grabbed the crystal first would keep it. The red core warrior told the others that with this request, everyone would see who was going to be the ultimate owner of the crystal. The warriors gained momentum, unsheathed their swords, and began to advance quickly towards Aang with the intention of ending his life. Upon seeing this, he simply adopted a defensive stance. At that moment, Sidu Liu suddenly remembered that dream. Thinking about it left her in shock. She had a bad feeling. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.